A man becomes truly invisible, not when he has power or wealth, or even when he's adored, but when he finally stops asking the world to validate his existence, when he no longer needs a reflection in someone else's eyes to feel real. That is when he slips quietly into something deeper, peace, not loud or flashy but resolute and calm. When he discovers he doesn't need permission to breathe, to wake up, to be. In that moment, society no longer sees him. He vanishes. But to himself, he stands tall. He becomes a ghost to the world, a god unto himself. Once, a thinker named Epicurus showed that this escape isn't defiance. It's the precise removal of all noise. Around him, people scrambled for fame and attention, clamored for validation. He slipped away. He didn't storm out in protest. He simply carved his own sanctuary, growing a life in serenity. No expectations dictated his dawn. No applause regulated his heartbeat. He lived his days serenely, fiercely free. You, living in the present moment, stand amid ruins too, although not of buildings, but of belief. Masculinity has been cheapened, solitude pathologized, freedom flagged as dangerous. From a young age, you were taught that without another, you are incomplete, that your identity is unlocked by her validation, that your worth is decided by how many hearts you can inflame, how beautifully you can entertain, how completely you can dissolve yourself to fit someone else's expectations. Oh, that's called love. Epicurus would call it madness, because the moment you need someone else to define your purpose, you trade your soul for a fleeting smile. The secret never taught in textbooks. A man who stops chasing applause becomes untouchable. A man who thrives in silence makes loneliness powerless. A man who is whole in solitude becomes the most formidable being, because he cannot be controlled, bought, or broken. His peace is not performance, it's fortress. Epicurus didn't run away from life. He refined it. He built a version of existence unshackled from seduction or status. He didn't vilify women. He refused to give them ultimate authority over his happiness. He understood that true pleasure grows not from the chase, but from the absence of chaos. That comfort is found not in warm embraces, but in mental calm. Yet here you are, sacrificing dignity to please, draining wallets, drowning in social noise, all because you fear silence and fear solitude, because in silence, you face yourself, the man you've avoided, the one with untended dreams, unanswered questions, and unclaimed strength. That terrifies you more than rejection ever could. But that is precisely where Epicurus wants you to begin. Enter a realm that our culture fears. The idea that freedom could be your final form, that being unmarried is not weakness, but uncharted territory for your spirit. A truly single man, single of mind, soul, not just status, is a rare creature that lives without begging for validation. He doesn't ask what he can contribute. He is the contribution, the foundation, the framework, the architecture of his own becoming. Yet many men never reach this. They wander deserts of desperation, choking on illusions that a date will define them, that a ring will make them complete, that fulfilling someone else's expectations will fill their emptiness. These men are easy to spot. They whisper, "Happy wife, happy life," with vacant stares and cracked smiles. They're domestic wolves in tuxedos, trained to perform for wedding photos. Epicurus would see this and mourn, not due to failure, but because they never questioned the race they're running. Epicurean thought is a scalpel, precise, savage in clarity. It doesn't say to flee women. It says, flee distraction. When modern relationships become emotional mines with tangled expectations, why would a man seek peace beneath that? He becomes a butler in a palace of applause, bananas in a cage. As Epicurus himself wrote, "The wealth required by nature is limited and easy to procure, but the wealth required by vain ideals extends to infinity." Replace wealth with love, and suddenly the scale of burden becomes clear. You're worn out not from solitude, but from contorting yourself to be lovable. You shrink your truth. You perform for approval. You pour resources into earning headlines in someone else's heart. You erected prison walls around yourself in hoping love would break you free. But you become smaller and smaller until you're just noise echoing in someone else's life. And you believe it's noble, this self-erasure. In reality, you tossed your map into the sea just to hear you're going the right way. You handed over the wheel of your life in exchange for cheap validation. Epicurus rejected that. He lived with companions under trees, planting gardens, tending wisdom. He discovered the fewer desires he had, the richer his existence became. Solitude offered him more joy than many marriages. We call that odd. Maybe the world is broken. But here's the question. Have you ever truly sat with yourself, willingly, not scrolling your phone, not fawning, not escaping, woken simply to savor a fresh cup and ask what's stirring in your own soul, rather than who's beside you? If you haven't, then your singleness isn't your enemy. It's your last battlefield. The moment you let go of romantic dependence, you begin to reclaim your divinity. Beyond slogans, beyond soft lies you cling to, beneath every longing lies a deeper fire. The alchemy of solitude, turning craving into character, noise into clarity, dependency into sovereignty. Because thriving, in Epicurus's terms, isn't getting by with a pleasant grin. It's conquering internal chaos. And most men never learn that stillness is strength. They're told hustle, acquisition, approval. No one teaches how to be, especially not alone, emotionally detached. They fear solitude, confusing silence with insignificance. Epicurus said, "The man who fears being alone fears everything, and fear shackles him." He's not choosing love. He's choosing to be chosen, entering relationships as a beggar in a suit, flattering approval, hoping fear doesn't squeeze his heart a bit more each time she ignores a message. He calls that romance. But it's spiritual death. And from childhood, the pattern is set. You comply, you're praised. You serve politely, you're rewarded. Every story, every film whispers, to be wanted is to be worthy. You never learned to build a kingdom. You learned to decorate a cage. Meanwhile, Epicurus taught that at the core of happiness lies peace. Peace cannot exist when your emotional thermostat is controlled by another. So for the single man, what others call loneliness is liberation. Every silent night is a reclaiming. Every morning spent in thought, every meal alone with your own mind, these are markers of autonomy. And ask, how many men with partners can dream loudly without self-editing, speak boldly without apology, walk away with dignity? Far fewer than those with nothing to lose. The true single man. His solitude is a temple. He reads truth, not to be seen, but to grow. He works out not for validation, but to command his spirit. He builds not for trophies, but because creation is fire in his vein. He becomes immune to rejection, immune to trends, indifferent to whether she thinks he's emotionally available. He doesn't perform. He remains still. In doing so, he becomes invisible to the superficial and luminous to the deep. That is thriving. You're not unloved for being flawed. You're unloved because the game favors submission. Your resolve terrifies the world. So be terrifying. The world doesn't need more agreeable men. It needs sovereign men, and those men are birthed in silence. Women were only the mirror. What you feared was your own reflection, the realization that your essence was never anchored in being desired, that you gave away your greatness for crumbs of approval instead of building something within. Epicurus saw through the illusion. Chains aren't physical. They're distractions, cheap thrills, shiny promises, bodies that warm before growing cold. You think you're choosing pleasure. You're accepting dependency dressed in nicer packaging. And although Epicurus taught that friendship is the great good of life, modern men swapped friendships for flirtations, brotherhood for hookups, depth for performance. You walk around wearing a grin glued to your mouth like a mask over a wound. You say you're happy when she calls, when she texts, when you're useful. But usefulness isn't love, it's employment. And when your value is utility, you're a tool, replaceable, breakable. Epicurus taught that peace begins when need ends, need not only of the body, but of the ego. Modern love is an ego transaction. You tell me I'm strong, I call you perfect. Praise in exchange for praise, time for attention, compliance for momentary warmth. Not love, warfare. A thriving single man has cast himself off the battlefield, not for lack of affection, but because he recognized the war as camouflage. Epicurus retreated from politics, fame, public ambition, not due to fear, but because freedom blooms in withdrawal. The man who is still tethered to others' emotions, who needs her love to breathe, is still enslaved. If silence makes you uncomfortable, you don't know yourself. You fear yourself. But singleness can be sacred, not as a holding pattern, but as consecration. It's the vessel in which you meet your true, unfiltered self. No flowers, no posts, no filters. Just a man breathing, unknowable to the world, magnificently unseen. Can you sit alone and still feel significant? Most can't. They rush back into the noise, into apps, banter, small talk masking emptiness. But not you. Not when you walk the Epicurean path. That path, though quiet, is brutal in its honesty. It probes. What do you do when nobody is watching? What do you believe when no echoes answer? What sort of man are you absent the audience? Those answers, the ones you discover there, define character. Epicurus didn't erect temples but gardens, natural spaces where thought outgrew desire, where wisdom replaced drama. His followers weren't lovers in crisis, but friends in communion, conversation over confession. This marks the second truth. The man who flourishes in solitude doesn't isolate, he refines. He doesn't eschew connection, he elevates it, choosing invitations to share his space with discipline and care. His peace, once rare, becomes valuable, and he stops giving it away cheaply. Modern men are impoverished, not in wallets, but in will. They trade energy for flirtation, dreams for comfort, fire for false emotional promises. The thriving man, by contrast, invests his hours like capital, guarding his mind like a citadel, planting thoughts like seeds and letting silence water them. Over time, others wonder how he became so calm, so wise. What they forget is that he had the courage to walk the hard path of being whole alone. So many men will lie silent in graves, with songs unsung, ideas unexplored, silence untamed. Not due to weakness, but due to distraction. They were convinced a woman's love would fill them, that attention would heal childhood fractures, that devotion would unlock permission to be themselves. But Epicurus would ask, who told you you were broken? The world sells completion. Epicurus offered sufficiency. The world says find the one. He told us to find our own center. Society hands out blueprints, status symbols, wedding bands, houses, babies, and defines that as purpose. Epicurus handed you a blank page and said, write your life, and on it, the greatest truth. Alone, you were always enough. The guilt must sting. Because after all this, many men will still return to the cage. They'll choose comfort over character, short-term pleasure over lifelong principle. They will build foundations of ego and emotion on shifting sand. And the result is generational. Fathers begin. Sons watch helplessly, and lineages forget what real power sounds like. But you've heard this now. The choice is yours. You can keep defining yourself by how well you serve someone else's emotional needs. Or you can begin the sacred work of being unshakable. You can stop asking what women want and ask what you were made to be, through discipline, solitude, ceremony of fire. For the man who thrives in singleness isn't rejecting love, he's rejecting dependency. He refuses to rent his soul for temporary warmth. He chooses stillness over chaos, sovereignty over approval, self-respect over self-erasure. In so doing, he becomes what Epicurus pointed at, not a monk, a flirt, or a hermit, but a man who is finally free. And if love ever arrives, it won't complete him. It will amplify him. It won't rescue him. It will stand beside him. Until then, tend your mind, protect your time, master your silence, and do not apologize for walking alone, because in Epicurus's kingdom, the man who walks alone skies the furthest. If this stirred something, a tremor in your soul, act now. Tend to this flame. Become the quiet pillar you've always known you could be. The man who learns to live without needing is not heartless. He is fearless. There is a difference, and the world struggles to see it. Because when you no longer need the sweetness of someone else's words to taste the richness of your own life, you become unsettling. You walk through rooms with a presence that demands nothing, and in that nothingness, you hold everything. You are no longer seduced by pretty promises or the temporary balm of attention. You are no longer on sale, and it begins to show, not in what you say, but in what you don't chase. You no longer rush to reply, to impress, to explain yourself. Your silence becomes your punctuation. Your restraint becomes your roar. You've stopped running after what runs from you because you've discovered that what's meant for you arrives without you having to bleed for it. They call it arrogance, but they don't see the nights you spent rebuilding your mind from rubble. They don't hear the conversations you've had with your demons, the way you've sat with shame until it named you brave. They weren't there when you stripped every false belief from your bones and stood trembling in front of your own naked soul. What they call pride is simply the peace of a man who survived his own abandonment and no longer fears being alone.